A beautiful black woman stood in the cold Chicago night, an unmarked envelope in her hand, staring at a man she had once pulled back from the edge of death with her bare hands. A man with a dragon tattoo climbing up his neck, dressed in a perfectly fitted black suit, worth more than everything she owned. A man who said only 7 words to her and then disappeared into the dark like he had never existed at all. She should have thrown that envelope away. She didn't. Months passed. A quiet, impossible arrangement built itself between them, between a black female doctor who had given everything to earn her place in this world, and a Korean mafia boss who ran half of Chicago from the shadows without ever raising his voice. No promises, no declarations. Just 2 people circling something neither of them had a name for. And then a Russian crime lord decided she was useful, decided she was a door he could walk through to get to the man she had been trying not to love. He sent his men to her apartment. He put her photograph on a table in a warehouse at the port like she was a piece on a board, like she was a thing. What he did not know, what no one in that warehouse could have imagined, was that the Korean mafia boss sitting across that table had been carrying something for 2 years. Something patient, something devastating, something that would make the most powerful man in the room reach for his vodka and find that his hand was no longer steady. He picked up the shovel, and he smiled. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. The hospital never truly slept. That was the first thing Celeste Warren had learned when she accepted the position at St. Marcus, back when she was still young enough to believe that exhaustion was a phase rather than a permanent address. The fluorescent lights hummed at the same pitch at 2 in the afternoon as they did at 2 in the morning, indifferent to the human bodies moving beneath them. Indifferent to the blood, the crying, the particular silence that fell over a room when someone stopped fighting. The hospital breathed in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the clock on the wall, and Celeste had long since synchronized herself to it, had given up on sleeping at normal hours, eating at normal hours, feeling things at normal hours. She operated on emergency time, which meant she operated on the edge of everything, always. She was 31 years old, and she had already seen more than most people see in a lifetime. She had seen men arrive with bullets lodged so close to their spines that the removal required a steadiness she had to manufacture from nothing, from sheer will, from the memory of her mother's voice telling her that her hands were made for something important. She had seen children arrive with injuries that had no clinical name, only a moral one. She had seen the powerful arrive in secret, stripped of their armor by the simple democracy of trauma. And she had treated them the same way she treated everyone, with precision, with silence, and with the unspoken agreement that what happened in her trauma bay stayed there. That agreement was not written anywhere. It was not in her contract, not in any hospital policy, not in the oath she had taken with her hand pressed flat against her chest in a room full of people who believed in the sanctity of that gesture. It lived, instead, in the particular way she moved through the world, with a gravity that said, "I see everything, and I am telling no one." It was a quality that certain people recognized on sight, the kind of people who made their living in the spaces between laws. It was raining the night they brought him in. She remembered the rain because it was the kind that fell without drama, without thunder or lightning. Just a steady and indifferent pour that made the city look like it was slowly dissolving. The ambulance bay doors had opened, and the gurney had come through fast. 2 paramedics shouting numbers at her. Blood pressure, pulse, estimated blood loss. and she had already been moving before they finished the first sentence, her hands snapping on gloves, her eyes running a rapid assessment of the man on the stretcher. No identification. No emergency contact. A name that was clearly fabricated. 3 stab wounds to the left side of the torso, clean and precise. The kind made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had chosen, deliberately, not to finish the job. He was Korean, tall for the gurney. His shirt had been cut open by the paramedics, and she could see, even through the blood, the edge of something dark climbing up from his chest toward his neck. The tail of a tattoo. A dragon rendered in black ink so deep it looked like a wound of its own. His eyes were closed. His face was terrifyingly still. And yet there was something about the way he lay there that did not read as helpless. Even unconscious, even bleeding, the man on her gurney carried the particular stillness of someone who had simply chosen to pause. The young nurse beside her, a new hire barely 3 months on the floor, had gone pale the moment the shirt came off. He had looked at the tattoo, then at Celeste, and she had seen it in his eyes. The recognition, the fear, the impulse to reach for a phone and call someone with authority. She had placed one hand briefly on his forearm, not harshly, just with enough pressure to redirect his attention, and she had said in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air between them, "Take care of the patient. That is the only thing that is happening in this room right now." He had listened. They all listened, eventually, when she used that voice. She worked for 4 hours. She removed 2 of the 3 blades. The third had lodged itself in a position that required a specialist she called in from home, a vascular surgeon who arrived in street clothes and did not ask questions because Celeste had done favors for him once that he had never properly repaid. They stabilized the patient before dawn, his vitals leveled, his breathing found its rhythm, and Celeste, standing at the sink washing blood from her forearms, had looked at her own reflection in the steel surface above the drain and felt the familiar, exhausted satisfaction of having pulled someone back from a place they should not have returned from. She never learned his name that night. She did not look for it. That was the agreement, the unwritten one, the one that lived in her gravity. She went home at 6 a.m, slept for 5 hours, and returned. She did not think about the man with the dragon tattoo for several days, and then she stopped thinking about him entirely, the way she stopped thinking about all of them eventually, because the alternative was carrying every single person she had ever touched in that building, and that weight would have flattened her long ago. 2 years passed. They passed the way years do when you are working too hard to properly observe them, in the texture of seasons rather than in specific days, in the way the light changed outside the ambulance bay windows, in the slow accumulation of a competence so deep it had begun to feel like a kind of loneliness. She was respected at St. Marcus in the manner that people respect a force of nature, with distance, with gratitude, and with the faint unease of those who sense they are in the presence of something they cannot fully account for. Her colleagues admired her. Her patients, when they were conscious enough to feel anything, trusted her instinctively. Her superiors left her alone because she produced results and results. In a public hospital, drowning in cases and understaffed since before she had arrived, were the only currency that mattered. She had no particular life outside those walls. That was not a complaint. It was simply the truth, stated without drama. She had friends she texted and rarely saw. She had an apartment on the north side with good light and not enough furniture. She had her mother's voice on the phone every Sunday, asking her the same questions in the same order. And she had the particular peace of a person who has learned to find everything they need in the doing of a single thing. She was not lonely. She was contained. There is a difference, and she knew it precisely. It was a Thursday. She remembered it was a Thursday because she had worked a double and was still in her coat, her stethoscope hanging around her neck like a habit she had forgotten to remove. When she walked out of the staff entrance into the cold air of a Chicago evening and found a man standing beside a black car parked directly across from the door. Not loitering, not waiting nervously, standing with the complete and composed stillness of someone who had calculated exactly how long it would take her to come through that door and had arrived with time to spare. She knew him immediately, even in the low light, even after 2 years. The dragon on his neck was unmistakable. The suit was different. Black, perfectly cut, not a crease out of place. But the stillness was the same. The terrifying, deliberate stillness of someone who had simply chosen to pause. He did not approach her. He waited until she had stopped walking, until she had processed what she was seeing, until the cold air had done its quiet work on the silence between them. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, produced a white envelope, and held it out at his side. Not extended toward her, just held, the way you might hold a door open and wait to see if someone walks through. She crossed the street. She took the envelope. She did not open it. She looked at him. His face was not warm. It was not cold either, exactly. It occupied a register she did not have a word for. Controlled, precise, assembled with care, and somewhere underneath all of that, something that was not quite human in its patience, but was not quite inhuman in its weight. He looked at her the way people look at things they have been carrying for a long time and are not yet ready to set down. He said, "I need a favor, doctor." She said, "The hospital has a process for donations. You can leave it at reception." Something moved across his face then. Not a smile, or rather, something that a smile might eventually become if given different circumstances and several more decades of practice. It lasted less than a second, and then it was gone, sealed back behind whatever it had briefly escaped from. He said, "It is not that kind of favor." She stood in the cold with the envelope in her hand, and she looked at this man. This man she had pulled back from the edge of death with her own hands 2 years ago. This man whose name she did not know and whose world she had never asked about. And she felt something that was not fear, and was not curiosity, and was not attraction, but was all three of those things compressed into a single sensation that settled somewhere in her chest and did not move. She said, "No." He said, "I understand." And then he got into the black car, and the black car drove away, and the Chicago night closed around the space where it had been, as though it had never existed at all. She stood there for a long moment in the cold. Then she looked down at the envelope in her hand. She did not open it. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked to her car. She drove home. She did not throw it away. 3 days was how long it took her. Not 3 days of deliberation, exactly. It was not as though she spread the decision across a table and examined it from every angle with the careful detachment she applied to a difficult diagnosis. It was more that the envelope sat on her kitchen counter for 3 days, positioned between a coffee mug she used every morning and a small plant she had owned for 4 years and never named. And every time she passed it, she felt its presence the way you feel the presence of a question that has already been answered but that you are not yet willing to speak aloud. She knew what was inside it. She had known from the moment she took it from his hand, from the moment she looked at his face in the cold air outside the staff entrance, and understood, with the particular clarity that came from years of reading bodies under pressure, that this man did not make requests lightly. That this man, in fact, probably did not make requests at all, and that whatever had brought him to that parking lot, standing beside a black car with a white envelope held at his side like a door held open, had cost him something she could not yet measure. On the third day, she opened it. Inside was a single card. No letterhead, no name, no address. A phone number printed in clean black type, and beneath it, 4 words. When you are ready. She stood at her kitchen counter with the card in her hand, and she thought about the night 2 years ago. The rain, the gurney, the blood, the young nurse whose face had gone pale at the sight of the tattoo. She thought about the 4 hours she had spent pulling that man back from a place he should not have returned from, and the particular satisfaction of having done it, and the fact that she had never once regretted it. Not because she approved of whatever world he moved through, but because her hands had been made for something important, and they did not ask for qualifying information before they did their work. She called the number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, unhurried, assembled with the same precision as everything else about him. He did not say hello. He said, "I appreciate you calling, Doctor." She said, "Tell me what you need." What he needed was simple, in the way that only genuinely dangerous things are simple. One of his people, he used the word people without elaboration, without apology, without any apparent awareness that it required either, had been injured during what he described only as a disagreement. The injury was serious. The man could not be taken to any official medical facility because his presence in Chicago was, as Quan put it, better kept informal. He needed someone who could come to a location he would provide, assess the situation, and do what was necessary. He would supply everything she required. She would be compensated. She would be protected. She said, "I don't need compensation." A pause. Brief, but she noticed it. He said, "I know." She wrote down the address. She gathered what she needed from the locked case beneath her bed, the one she had assembled over 2 years of working in neighborhoods where the distance between a wound and a hospital could mean the difference between a scar and a funeral. She drove to the location, which turned out to be a clean and unremarkable apartment on the west side, furnished with the deliberate neutrality of a place that was meant to be forgotten. The injured man was young, younger than she had expected, and frightened in a way that the injured man on her gurney 2 years ago had never been. She worked quietly and efficiently. The wound was deep but manageable. She stitched, administered, instructed. The young man looked at her with enormous eyes and said in accented English that he had not expected a doctor like her. She said, "What kind of doctor did you expect?" He seemed unable to answer that. She did not press him. Quan was not in the apartment when she arrived, but he was there when she finished. Standing in the narrow hallway outside the bedroom door, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the full geography of the dragon tattoo visible now in a way it had not been before. She noticed it the way you notice a piece of art that has been placed in an unexpected location, with a kind of involuntary attention that has nothing to do with choice. He looked at the young man through the open doorway. Something moved across his face. Brief, controlled, sealed away almost immediately. But she caught it. She'd spent enough years reading faces that were trying not to be read to recognize relief when it appeared in disguise. He said, "Thank you." She picked up her case. She said, "The wound needs to be checked in 48 hours. I'll leave instructions." He said, "I'll make sure it happens." She moved past him toward the front door. And then, she was not entirely sure why, whether it was the exhaustion or the cold or the particular atmosphere of that clean and unremarkable apartment, she stopped. She turned. She said, "What's your name?" He looked at her for a moment with that assembled, precise face. Then he said, "Kwon Jae-won." She nodded. She left. What followed was not a relationship, in any definition of that word that the world outside would have recognized. It was an arrangement, except that it was warmer than that. It was a friendship, except that it was more careful than that. It was something that existed in the negative space between categories, in the hours after midnight when she drove across the city to treat another of his people, in the brief and infrequent meals at the Korean restaurant near the river that he had reserved permanently, a detail she discovered only when she arrived early one evening and the owner met her at the door with a deference so total it bordered on ceremonial. She treated 7 people over the course of those months. Some were frightened, like the first one. Some were stoic in a way that told her they had been trained for it. One was a woman, unexpected somehow, though she could not explain why, who held her hand during the procedure with a grip so tight it left a mark, and who said afterward, in perfect, unaccented English, that she was glad it was her. Celeste never asked questions about the circumstances, not because she was incurious, but because she understood, with the same clinical precision she applied to everything, that the information would change the moral texture of what she was doing in ways she was not prepared to manage. She knew what Kwon was. She was not naive enough to pretend otherwise. But she had grown up in a neighborhood where the line between the worlds that operated within the law and the worlds that operated outside it had never been as clear as the people who drew it seemed to believe. And she had long since made her peace with the fact that the hands she used to heal people did not always get to choose who those people were. Kwon, for his part, was precise about the boundaries. He never asked her to do anything other than what she had agreed to. He never brought her into conversations she had not been invited into. He never used her name in rooms she had not entered. And he ensured, with a thoroughness she only gradually came to understand the full scope of, that the neighborhood where she lived was quietly and completely safe. No broken cameras, no escalating street tensions, no incidents in the 4-block radius around her building. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you have grown accustomed to. She did not comment on it. He did not mention it. They ate together irregularly, when her schedule permitted, which was rarely, and when he was in the city, which was not always. The restaurant was small and always empty when they used it, which she eventually understood was not coincidence. He ordered the same dish every time, a pork belly with a particular preparation that the kitchen seemed to know to begin when he called ahead, which told her he called ahead, which told her the meals were not as spontaneous as they appeared. She always arrived 5 minutes late, not from carelessness, but from the habit of a woman who had spent her entire life ensuring she was never the most eager person in any room. The conversations were not what she expected. She had anticipated silence, or the clipped exchanges of someone who communicated only in the minimum necessary. Instead, she found a man who asked questions with genuine attention. About medicine, about the specific mechanics of the cases she described in the abstract. about the experience of working in the neighborhoods where she worked. He listened with the complete stillness of someone to whom listening was not a passive act, but an active one, a choice made deliberately and maintained with effort. She asked him once, over the second or third meal, why he had come to her specifically. Not the night of the first favor, she understood that, but the original night, the night of the rain and the gurney. Why St. Marcus? Why that particular hour? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We were close. It was the nearest facility." She looked at him. He said, "And I had been told you were someone who understood discretion." She said, "By who?" He said, "People talk, in certain circles, about certain doctors." She held his gaze. She said, "That's not the whole answer." He looked at her for a long moment with that face that gave nothing away, and then he said, very quietly, "No, it isn't." He did not offer the rest of it. She did not push. But something shifted in the texture of the silence between them after that. Something small and precise, like a single note added to a chord that had previously been missing it without anyone noticing. She drove home that night through the quiet streets of her protected neighborhood, and she sat in her car for a long time before going inside, watching the rain begin against the windshield. And she thought about a man who had almost died on her gurney, and who had come back 2 years later not to repay a debt, but to create one. And she thought about the fact that she had let him. And she thought about what that meant about her. And she did not arrive at any conclusions that satisfied her, which was, she suspected, exactly the point. She did not see the danger coming. Little did she know that at that exact moment, in a warehouse 3 miles from where she sat in her car in the rain, a man with white hair and cold eyes and a scar on his chin was sitting across a table from 2 of his lieutenants, holding a photograph. The photograph was of her, taken outside the hospital, taken without her knowledge, and the man with white hair was looking at it with the expression of someone who has just identified the precise location of a lock they have been searching for. Calm, satisfied, and utterly without mercy. His name was Dmitry Volkov, and he had just decided that Celeste Warren was useful. 12:23. The photograph was not the first one. That was the detail that would have frightened her most had she known. Not that Dmitry Volkov had a photograph of her, but that he had several. A small collection, assembled over the course of 3 weeks by a man whose specific talent was the gathering of information without leaving evidence of the gathering. The photographs were unremarkable individually. Celeste entering the hospital, Celeste leaving the hospital, Celeste at the Korean restaurant on the river, Celeste in her car outside her building on a Tuesday evening with a coffee cup in her hand and her head tilted back and her eyes closed for a moment. Just a moment, in the particular exhaustion of someone who allows themselves to rest only when they believe no one is watching. That last photograph was the one Dmitry returned to most often. Not because it was the most informative, it wasn't, but because it told him something about her that the others didn't. It told him she was human. That underneath the gravity, underneath the precision, underneath whatever armor she had constructed over years of operating at the edge of everything, there was a woman who got tired. And tired people, in Dmitry Volkov's long and instructive experience, were people who could be moved. He had been watching Kwon Jae-won for considerably longer than 3 weeks. He had been watching him, in fact, for the better part of 2 years, since the first quiet expansions of the Huk-yong organization into territory that the Bratva had historically considered negotiable. Not owned exactly. Negotiable. There was a difference that mattered enormously in the particular grammar of the world these men inhabited, and Quan had either not understood that difference, or had understood it perfectly and chosen to disregard it, which was in some ways more troubling. Dmitri was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived things that had ended other men, had survived them not through exceptional violence, though he was capable of that, but through a quality of patience so developed it had become indistinguishable from wisdom. He waited. He watched. He allowed situations to reveal their own architecture before he moved within them. It was a methodology that had served him for 30 years and that he saw no reason to abandon now, even as the city around him changed in ways that occasionally made him feel like a man reading a map of a country that no longer existed. What he had learned about Kwon Jae-won over 2 years of watching was this. The man was disciplined to a degree that was almost inhuman, controlled in every visible dimension of his operation, and almost entirely without personal vulnerabilities. No vices that could be leveraged. No financial exposure that hadn't been anticipated and neutralized. No loyalties that could be turned. He ran his organization the way a surgeon operated, cleanly, precisely, with the minimum necessary intervention and the maximum possible outcome. It was, Dmitri could admit privately, impressive. Impressive and deeply inconvenient. And then there was the doctor. The doctor was new. The doctor was, as far as Dmitri's man could determine, the only person in Kwan's orbit who existed outside the formal structure of the organization, who had not been recruited, had not been vetted through the usual processes, had not arrived through any of the channels that Dmitri had learned to monitor. She had arrived, instead, through an emergency room at 2 a.m, which was not a channel anyone had thought to watch. She treated his people. She ate with him. She drove home through streets that his scouts had noticed were conspicuously, unusually quiet. She was not a weakness, exactly. Not yet. But she was a surface. The first surface Dmitri had found in 2 years of looking. And a surface, properly applied to, could become an opening. He sent 2 men to her apartment on a Wednesday evening. He chose Wednesday because her schedule, which his man had reconstructed from 3 weeks of observation, indicated she would be home by 9 and alone. He chose 2 men because 1 man could be dismissed as a coincidence, and 2 men could not. He wanted her to understand, with absolute clarity, that she had been seen, that the invisibility she had assumed was not real, had never been real, and that the world she had agreed to brush against had been brushing against her in return without her knowledge. The message they delivered was precise. Disappear for 2 weeks, or tell them where to find Kwon Jae-won. She did not call the police. She sat in her apartment for 11 minutes after the 2 men left. She knew it was 11 minutes because the television was on and she tracked it against the program. And she thought about the plant on her kitchen counter that she had owned for 4 years and never named. And she thought about her mother's voice on the phone every Sunday, asking the same questions in the same order. And she thought about the young man with the enormous eyes who had said he had not expected a doctor like her. And she thought about the envelope and the card and the 4 words printed beneath the phone number. When you are ready. She picked up her phone. She called. He answered on the first ring this time. She told him what had happened in the precise, sequential manner of someone reporting clinical findings. The time of arrival, the physical descriptions of the 2 men, the exact wording of the message, the absence of any explicit threat beyond the implied. She did not use the words frightened or shaken. because she was a woman who had spent her entire adult life refusing to use those words, even when they were accurate. Which they were now, in a frequency she could feel in the base of her sternum, like a second heartbeat she had not consented to. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. She counted. And then he said, in a voice so quiet it barely existed, "Do not leave the apartment." She said, "Kwan, I don't run from—" He said her name. Just her name. Celeste. One word, 2 syllables, delivered with a weight she had not heard from him before. Not the weight of command exactly, though it contained that. The weight of something more primary than command. The weight of a person addressing something they are not willing to lose. She said, "Fine." She stayed. He arrived at Dmitry Volkov's warehouse without announcement, without escort, without any of the formal apparatus that attended such meetings between men of his particular standing. He drove himself, a detail that Dmitry's men at the door noted with visible unease, because a man who drove himself to a meeting like this was either a man who trusted no one or a man who needed no one. And both possibilities were troubling in different ways. The warehouse was at the port. It smelled of salt water and old machinery, and the particular chemical neutrality of a space that had been cleaned too many times and too thoroughly. Dmitry was seated at a folding table near the center of the floor, a bottle of vodka and 2 glasses in front of him, his white hair brilliant under the industrial lighting, his gray coat buttoned to the throat despite the warmth of the space. 2 of his men stood at the perimeter. Kwan counted them without appearing to count them, and noted their positions with the reflexive precision of someone for whom spatial awareness was not a skill, but a biological function. Dmitry smiled when he saw him. It was a genuine smile. That was the unsettling thing about Dmitry, Kwan had always found. His warmth and his menace occupied exactly the same frequency. He said, "Sit down. Have a drink." Kwan sat. He did not touch the vodka. Dmitry poured for himself. He did not appear bothered by Kwan's refusal. He looked at the younger man across the table with the expression of a person who was enjoying a situation he has constructed, which he had, and which Kwan knew he had, and which Kwan allowed him to believe was an advantage. Dmitry said, "You came alone." Kwan said, "I came to resolve." Dmitry leaned back in his chair. He turned the glass slowly in his fingers. He said, "You know why you're here." Kwan said, "You sent 2 men to a woman who is not part of our arrangement." Dmitry tilted his head. He said, "She is part of your arrangement, which makes her relevant to ours." Kwan said nothing. Dmitry said, "I have no interest in the woman specifically. She is a means. You understand means, Jaewon. You are a practical man." Kwan said, "What do you want?" Dmitry set down the glass. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. Large hands, deliberate hands. Hands that had done things he had never been held accountable for. And he looked at Kwan with an expression that had shifted from warmth to something older and more considered. He said, "The territory on the south side. The 3 blocks around the Halstead corridor. You've moved into them quietly. I want them back." Kwan said, "They were never yours." Dmitry said, "They were negotiable. You made them not negotiable. I want them made negotiable again." Kwan looked at him. He said, "And if I don't?" Dmitry unfolded his hands. He reached into the inside pocket of his gray coat and produced a photograph and placed it on the table between them, face up, without drama. It was the photograph of Celeste in her car. Head back, eyes closed, coffee cup in hand. Completely unaware. Dmitri said, "She is very beautiful and very exposed." The warehouse was silent except for the sound of water against the dock outside and the distant machinery of the port. Quan looked at the photograph for a long moment. His face revealed nothing. Not anger, not fear, not the particular controlled fury that was building somewhere beneath the surface of everything with a pressure he was managing the way you manage a structural crack. Carefully, constantly, aware that the management itself is a form of danger. He looked up from the photograph to Dimitri's face. And then Quan Che-wan smiled. It was not the almost smile she had seen at the hospital parking lot. It was not the barely contained something that passed across his face at the restaurant. This was a full smile. Slow, complete, and so entirely wrong in the context of what was happening that every person in that warehouse felt it land in their chest like a stone dropped into still water. Dimitri's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but it shifted. Quan said in Russian, fluent, unaccented, perfect Russian that Dmitri had not known he possessed, "Bring me the shovel." One of Dimitri's men looked at the other. The other looked at Dmitri. Dmitri, for the first time in the evening, did not look certain. It was a small thing, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible recalibration of his posture. But Quan saw it the way he saw everything, completely, immediately, and without allowing the seeing to show on his face. He had spoken in Russian, perfect Russian, the kind that did not come from a language course or from years of business dealings with Russian associates. The kind that came from immersion, from study so deep and deliberate it had become instinct. He had kept it in reserve for 2 years, this particular card, waiting for the precise moment when its reveal would do the most damage. Not physical damage, the other kind. The kind that destabilized a man's understanding of what he was dealing with, and therefore of what he could safely do next. The shovel arrived. One of the men brought it from against the far wall. Old, the handle worn smooth from use, the blade dark with rust and old earth. He carried it the way you carry something whose purpose you are suddenly uncertain of, and he set it on the ground near the table without making eye contact with anyone. Quan did not reach for it immediately. He let it sit there. He let the silence sit there with it. He understood, with the precision of someone who had studied the mechanics of fear for a very long time, that the most powerful threats were the ones that remained briefly unexplained. That the imagination of a frightened man was a more effective instrument than almost anything you could say to him out loud. Dmitri was not a frightened man, but he was a man who had just been surprised, and surprise, in someone of Dmitri's training and experience, produced a temporary condition that functioned very similarly to fear. Quan had approximately 90 seconds before Dmitri recovered his equilibrium and the window closed. He picked up the shovel. He held it in both hands, weighing it, examining it with the calm attention of someone assessing a tool. Then he turned it and extended it toward Dmitri, handle first, blade toward the floor, and held it there across the table between them. Dmitri did not take it. Quan said, still in Russian, "You buried it wrong." A pause. Dmitri's eyes moved from the shovel to Quan's face. Quan said, 3 years ago. The woman at the Calumet site. Your man used too much lime and moved too fast. The soil displacement was visible from the access road for 6 months afterward, to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Fortunately for you, the people who used that road were not, for the most part, the kind of people who reported things to anyone with the authority to investigate. He set the shovel down against the table between them, blade down, handle angled toward Dmitri like an offering or an accusation. The geometry of the thing made it impossible to tell which. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced an envelope, white, unmarked, the same kind he had given Celeste 2 years ago outside the hospital, and he placed it on the table next to the photograph of her. The two objects sat side by side under the industrial lighting, and Dmitri looked at them with an expression that was undergoing a complex and visible internal revision. Quan said, "Inside that envelope are photographs of the Calumet site taken over an 8-month period. Survey records from a geological assessment company that was contracted to examine soil anomalies in that area. A toxicology report prepared by an independent laboratory, and a sworn statement from a man who was present that night and who has been living very quietly and very comfortably in a country that does not have an extradition agreement with the United States for the past 30 months. He let that settle. Then he said, "The woman who was buried at that site was the daughter of a Ukrainian parliamentarian named Boris Kovalenko. Senator Kovalenko has been in communication with investigators at the international level for 2 years regarding his daughter's disappearance. He has not, until now, had anything concrete enough to act on. He is, however, a man of considerable patience and considerable resources, and he has made it very clear to the people he works with that he intends to pursue this matter until it reaches a conclusion." Dmitri's hands, still folded on the table, had not moved. But the quality of their stillness had changed, had gone from the deliberate stillness of a man in control to the rigid stillness of a man who is very carefully not moving because movement might reveal something. Quan said, "The contents of that envelope are currently held by 3 separate attorneys in 3 separate jurisdictions, with instructions for immediate delivery to Senator Kovalenko's legal team in the event that I do not make personal contact with each of them within 72 hours. He picked up the photograph of Celeste from the table. He looked at it for a moment, her head back, her eyes closed, the coffee cup in her hand. The particular exhaustion of a woman allowing herself one moment of rest in a life that did not offer many. Something moved through him then that he did not allow onto his face, and that he would not examine until much later, in the quiet of the restaurant after she had gone home, when he would sit with the same glass of water he always ordered and think about what it meant that a photograph taken without her knowledge had made him feel, for approximately 4 seconds, something very close to the thing he had spent 38 years constructing himself not to feel. He put the photograph in his jacket pocket. He said, "Celeste Warren will not be approached, mentioned, photographed, or considered by anyone in your organization or any organization with which you have a relationship. Not now. Not after this conversation. Not in 5 years. Not in the context of any future disagreement between your interests and mine. She does not exist in that world. She has never existed in that world. If I become aware of any deviation from this understanding, any deviation, regardless of how indirect or how small, the envelope moves." He stood. He adjusted his jacket. The dragon on his neck caught the industrial light, and for a moment it appeared to move. A trick of the shadows, or perhaps of the atmosphere, which had taken on the particular density of a room in which something has just irrevocably shifted. He looked at Dmitri. Dmitri, who had not spoken since Quan had begun, was looking at him with an expression that had completed its revision and arrived at something new. Something that was not quite respect, because respect between men like these was never quite what it was called, but that was in the same neighborhood. The expression of a man who has tested something and discovered, with a mixture of irritation and acknowledgement, that it is stronger than he had assumed. Then Dmitri said something that Kwan had not expected. He said,
"She really is too good for you."
The warehouse was completely still. The water moved against the dock outside. The machinery continued its distant, indifferent work. Kwan looked at Dmitri for a long moment, and then, for the second time that evening, he smiled. But this smile was different from the one that had silenced the room. This one was quieter. This one came from somewhere that the first one hadn't. This one, had Celeste been present to witness it, would have been the most frightening and the most human thing she had ever seen on his face. He said, "I know." He walked to the door. At the threshold, he paused, his back still to the room, his hand not quite touching the frame. He said, "The shovel stays. Consider it a reminder." And then he walked out into the cold air of the Chicago port, and the door closed behind him, and the sound of his footsteps disappeared into the noise of the water and the night. Inside the warehouse, no one spoke for a long time. Dmitri sat at the table and looked at the shovel leaning against it, and the empty space where the envelope and the photograph had been. He picked up his glass of vodka. He looked at it. He set it down without drinking. One of his lieutenants said carefully, "What do you want us to do?" Dmitri was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nothing. We do nothing." The lieutenant said, "And the territory?" Dmitri picked up the shovel from where it leaned against the table. He turned it in his hands the way Kwan had, weighing it, examining it, the gesture now carrying a different kind of meaning than it had 10 minutes ago. Then he leaned it back against the table and looked at it with an expression that was tired and old, and somewhere beneath the calculation, something that might, in a different man, have been called honest. He said, "The territory was always negotiable. She found out in pieces. Not from Kwan directly. She had not expected that, and she did not receive it. What she received instead was the sudden and complete evaporation of the threat, which was itself a form of communication in the language she was learning to read." The two men did not return. The feeling of being watched, which she had not consciously registered until it was gone, disappeared from the air around her building like a weather system that had moved on. Her neighborhood returned to its particular protected quiet. And Kwan appeared at the restaurant the following Friday evening and sat down and ordered the same dish and looked at her across the table with his assembled, precise face as though nothing had occurred. She arrived 5 minutes late, as always. She sat down. She looked at him for a long moment with the clinical attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Not the detached attention of the examining room, but the other kind. The kind she deployed rarely and carefully, and only on things that she had decided were worth the risk of seeing clearly. She said, "What did you do?" He said, "I resolved it." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "It's the answer I have." She held his gaze. She said, "Were you always going to resolve it? From the beginning, before I even called you?" He was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to tell her everything. She said, "Kwan." He said, "You called me. I resolved it. That is what happened." She leaned back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the low ceiling of the small restaurant, the warm light, the permanent emptiness of the space that he had arranged so that she could sit in it without being seen by the wrong people. She thought about the envelope and the card and the 4 words. She thought about the young man with the enormous eyes. She thought about the photograph she did not know existed that was now in his jacket pocket, that would remain there until he was alone. She said, "You can't keep doing this." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not yours to protect." He looked at her. The restaurant was completely quiet. Somewhere in the kitchen, something was cooking. The same dish, always the same dish, begun when he called ahead, which told her he had called ahead, which told her all the things it had always told her, and that she was now, for the first time, allowing herself to hear. He said, "No, you're not." She said, "But you're going to anyway." He did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was in the stillness, in the assembled and precise face that was, she now understood, not the absence of feeling, but the container for it. The structure built specifically to hold something that would otherwise be unmanageable. Something that a man like Kwon Jae-won had never been given the language to carry any other way. She picked up the menu she never ordered from. She set it down. She said, "You can't keep doing this without me knowing." He looked at her. She said, "If I'm in this, and I am in this, whether either of us chose it, then I'm in it with information. Not after the fact, not in pieces. With information. That's the only way this works." A silence. Long enough that she began to think he was going to refuse, to retreat behind the assembled face and the low voice and the precision. To give her the answer, "I have," rather than the answer she was asking for. Then he said, "Agreed." One word. But the way he said it, the weight he placed on it, the particular care with which he delivered it, as though it were something he was setting down in her hands and trusting her to hold, made it feel like considerably more than one word. She nodded. She looked at the table. And then, because she was a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to perform emotions she was not actually feeling, and because she was actually feeling something she did not yet have a name for, she said nothing else for a while. She simply sat in the warm light of the small restaurant, and she breathed, and she let the thing settle into the space between them where it had, she now understood, been living for quite some time. Later, when she was in her car and the Chicago night was moving past the windows and the heater was doing its patient work against the cold, she thought about what Dmitry Volkov had said. She had not been told the exact words. Kwon had given her the resolution, not the theater of it, but she had reconstructed enough from the pieces to understand the shape of what had happened. And somewhere in that reconstruction, she found the phrase, the one that Kwon had not repeated to her, and that she had nonetheless arrived at through the particular diagnostic clarity of a woman who was very good at reading what bodies did not say. "She's too good for you." She sat with it for a long time. She turned it in her mind the way Kwon had turned the shovel, weighing it, examining it, feeling for what it actually meant beneath what it appeared to mean. It was meant as a dismissal, as a diminishment of him, as the kind of thing powerful men said to each other when they wanted to locate a vulnerability and press on it. But Kwon had smiled and had agreed, and had walked out of that warehouse with the photograph in his pocket and the envelope in the hands of 3 lawyers in 3 countries, and had appeared at the restaurant on Friday evening and ordered the same dish and waited for her to arrive 5 minutes late, as she always did. The agreement was not a concession. She understood that now. It was the most honest thing he knew how to say. She started the car. She drove home through the quiet streets. The rain had returned, the same kind as always, steady and indifferent, the kind that did not ask permission and did not offer explanation, that simply fell because that was the nature of the thing. Because some forces do not announce themselves, they simply persist, quietly and without drama, until the world around them adjusts. She parked outside her building. She sat for a moment in the dark with the engine off and the rain on the glass. She thought, I should walk away from this. She thought, I am not going to walk away from this. She got out of the car. She went upstairs. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the plant she had owned for 4 years and never named. And she thought about it for a long moment, and then, quietly and without ceremony, she gave it one. She called it Jay. She went to bed. She slept without difficulty, which was unusual for her, and which she noted with the clinical precision she applied to everything, and which she did not attempt to explain because some things, she had decided, did not require explanation. They only required the willingness to let them be true. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been used as a weapon against someone you cared about? Turned into leverage by someone who assumed your connection made you weak instead of making both of you stronger? Have you ever watched someone protect you in silence, without asking for credit, without needing you to witness it, and only understood what they had done long after the danger had passed? And have you ever been told, directly or indirectly, that you were too good for something you had already chosen with your whole heart, and had to decide for yourself whether that was a warning or simply someone else's fear speaking? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, silent loyalty, and the kind of love that protects without possessing, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.